they were unapproved. Mrs. Hartman, the president, smugly threatened me with fines. She had no idea who she was messing with. What she didn't know, I wasn't backing down. But let me take you back to the start. Jake Thompson was a simple man with a passion for gardening. His small suburban home in the heart of Maplewood was his pride and joy. With a white picket fence, perfectly manicured lawns, and rows of vibrant flowers, his house was an oasis of color in an otherwise quiet neighborhood. On a crisp spring morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, Jake was out in his garden, tending to his precious roses. He always felt at peace with the earth beneath his hands, and his garden was a sanctuary after a long workday. Jake, a man in his mid-30s with short, dark brown hair and green eyes, wore his usual gardening gear: old, faded jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, and well-worn boots. The sun kissed his skin as he squatted down, carefully pruning a rose bush. He paused for a moment, inhaling the sweet scent of the flowers, before returning to his task. His backyard, bordered by a low wooden fence, was his pride. Rows of tulips, sunflowers, and petunias, among other colorful blooms, filled the space. However, his tranquility was soon interrupted. Jake heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Mrs. Hartman, the HOA president, walking briskly toward him. Mrs. Hartman was in her early 50s, a woman with tight blonde curls and a stiff posture that screamed authority. Her stern face was framed by the sharp angles of her glasses. She held a clipboard in her hand, her lips tightly pressed together in a way that made Jake instinctively tense. "Jake," she said, her tone more official than friendly, "I'm here to inform you that you've been fined for having unapproved plants in your garden." Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? My plants? What's wrong with them?" Mrs. Hartman adjusted her glasses and checked her clipboard. "Some of them are not on the approved list according to the HOA's landscaping guidelines. You'll have to remove them or you'll face another fine." Jake stood up, his expression changing from confusion to frustration. "These are just flowers. They've been here for years. What's the problem now?" "It doesn't matter," she said dismissively. "You have 30 days to remove them. If not, the fine will double. And next time, it won't be just a fine. There will be further actions taken." Jake clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the injustice. "This is ridiculous." Mrs. Hartman didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked back down the driveway, leaving Jake standing there, boiling with frustration. The idea that someone could dictate what he could plant in his own backyard was absurd. He wasn't about to let this slide. The battle was just beginning. Jake spent the next few days fuming about the absurdity of the fine. How could the HOA fine him for something as harmless as flowers? He had been following the neighborhood's guidelines for years, and now, out of nowhere, they wanted to control his plants? That's when he decided he wasn't going to take this lying down. He'd been a resident of Maplewood for over 5 years, and he knew he had rights. He wasn't going to let Mrs. Hartman and her HOA dictate his life. That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table, staring at the fine notice, a mix of anger and determination in his eyes. He needed a plan. The first thing he did was call his neighbor, Rachel. Rachel had always been the voice of reason in the neighborhood. She was a lawyer in her late 30s with long auburn hair and a sharp, confident demeanor. She lived 2 doors down and had become one of Jake's closest friends. He trusted her judgment. "Rachel," Jake said, pacing as he spoke, "you won't believe what happened. The HOA just fined me for my garden. They say I have unapproved plants." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice full of disbelief. "What's their reasoning?" Jake explained the situation, detailing the plants that Mrs. Hartman had singled out. "I've never had any problems before. It just doesn't make sense." Rachel sighed. "Look, Jake, we can't let them get away with this. You need to stand up for yourself. We'll get to the bottom of this. Let's start by checking if they've been doing this to anyone else." The next day, Rachel helped Jake gather evidence. They took photos of the garden, making sure to document every plant. Rachel went through the HOA's rules and regulations, searching for any contradictions. The more they dug, the more they realized that the HOA had no valid reason for the fine. This was just another case of overreach. 2 weeks later, Jake received another letter from the HOA. This time it was a formal warning, demanding that he remove the unapproved plants or face more serious consequences. The letter was signed by Mrs. Hartman herself. Jake was ready for a fight. He called Rachel and told her it was time to take action. With her legal expertise, Rachel helped Jake file a formal complaint with the HOA, demanding that they revoke the fine. At the same time, Jake began reaching out to his neighbors, letting them know what was going on. To his surprise, many of them were facing similar issues. Some had been fined for overgrown shrubs, while others were reprimanded for minor changes to their landscaping. On the day of the HOA meeting, Jake stood outside the community center, waiting. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he felt confident. This was his moment. He wasn't just fighting for his garden, he was fighting for his right to have a say in how he maintained his own property. Inside the meeting, Jake, Rachel, and several of his neighbors presented their cases. They presented the photos of Jake's garden and pointed out how the HOA's own guidelines didn't clearly prohibit the plants in question. Rachel argued that the HOA had no legal grounds to fine Jake, as the plants were not causing any harm or violating any clear rules. Mrs. Hartman was defensive, but as the meeting went on, it became clear that she was losing ground. One by one, other neighbors began to speak up, expressing their dissatisfaction with the HOA's overreach. The tide was turning. Jake had gathered the support of the community, and together they were stronger than the HOA. After a tense and heated meeting, the judge, who was overseeing the dispute, finally rendered a verdict. The HOA's fine was deemed invalid. Jake was not required to remove any plants from his garden. Not only that, but the HOA was ordered to pay for all court fees. Jake's victory sent ripples through the neighborhood. The HOA had no choice but to back down. Mrs. Hartman, embarrassed by the public defeat, resigned from her position as president. The neighbors, once fearful of the HOA's strict rules, felt empowered. In the days that followed, Jake's garden became a symbol of resistance.